I mean, we are a vulnerable population, and a lot of our fears and anxieties have been manipulated for financial gain. We have to be honest about that. And there's a lot of predatory marketing. So I think people are just so sick of that, and it's a lot of noise. So they're like, I just want good information. And I think finding reputable resources and talking to experts. And my biggest thing is, I'm not a fertility doctor that says to everyone, you must freeze your eggs. But I think if you could find yourself in a situation where you might be building your family in your mid to late 30s or later, it's smart to just learn about the process so you can make an informed decision. It doesn't mean you have to do it.
Lucky, welcome to That Desi Spark.
Thank you for having me.
I am so thrilled to have this conversation with you today. I want to start from the very beginning. When you were young, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Not a doctor. I was like, I think my parents want me to become a doctor,
Yes.
So I am going to be a writer. I'm going to be an artist. I'm going to be anything that you're not urging me to be, basically. I rebelled, but naturally I loved biology, and I loved learning about reproductive physiology. I just found it very interesting to talk about hormones from a very early age. I mean, even back in health class. And then even in undergrad, I'm Canadian, so I call college undergrad or university. I gravitated towards all the pre-med classes, but I kept telling my family, I am not going to become a doctor. I'm going to find something else. I'm going to become a bioethicist or something other than going into medicine. And then I was looking for something to do during one of my summers as an internship because, you know what it's like. Mm-hmm. You always want to be productive. And I stumbled upon this opportunity at the Cleveland Clinic, and the rest was history. I worked with a bunch of men talking about sperm all day long. It was an andrology lab. And that's where I learned about IVF and the concept of egg freezing. And I just thought it was so mind-blowing that this did not exist before the 1970s, IVF specifically. And it was moving at breakneck speed and helping people to have families, and then also helping women to potentially preserve their fertility and have options that our moms and our grandmas never had. And that really spoke to me. And then I was like, okay, how do I get into this field? I guess I have to go into medicine. And that led me down a whole rabbit hole of first you have to do your OBGYN residency after med school and then subspecialize. And it's just been such a lifelong passion and goal of mine. Now it's been over 20 years of education and training combined. And I'm so happy that I stumbled upon it because it truly is my purpose and meaning in life. And the conversations I have with women and couples every day are just so meaningful that they let me into their world, and I'm in this privileged position to help them with something that is such a vulnerable area, and it has so much stigma and fear attached to it. So the fact that I get to be part of a conversation that takes some of that away is very meaningful to me.
Was there something your parents did or didn't do that you think nudged you or really helped the seed of wanting to be in fertility sort of grow?
Well, my parents immigrated from India to England, but they were part of a mass migration, and I find that when that happens, ideas tend to be less progressive because you stay in your own little bubble in the communities that they were in. But what was really interesting is out of everyone in their community, they always had a very progressive slant when it came to having 3 daughters and the type of messaging they would put forward when it came to marriage and settling down and things like that. Unlike many of our peers who were, feeling pressured about finding their person and getting married even in their, mid to late 20s, our parents were like, no, you have to become what you're going to become and focus on your career, and you're not allowed to get married until over 30. And I was like, that's so random and weird that they would say that to us. And now I'm like, I don't think anyone should really be that prescriptive about it. I think there's a right time for everyone, but I think it took a lot of pressure off of us, and it definitely has shaped the way I feel as a woman, as a professional woman who also is a mom, and helping other people navigate that balance.
What were the dinner table conversations like?
Well, I mean, I definitely was the one who pushed the envelope. Like, I would come home and talk about my sperm research, and I would like, you know, just forget where I was for a minute, and I would like talk about the cultural stigmas and things that we see growing up. I remember saying to my dad, "Oh my God, I just learned in genetics that it's actually the male that passes on the X or the Y. So like, how come in Indian movies or like in our culture, women have been traditionally blamed for not being able to bear a son? Like it's actually the man's sperm." And my dad was like, "Okay, that's enough. Like we don't need to talk about this while we're eating." So I think they all think I'm a bit much, but now in a different version because, you know, I'm a doctor, I'm a professional, but I don't take myself too seriously. And, you know, they see what I do on Instagram, all my antics, and they're just like, what the hell? So that's just, you know, I'm the youngest girl in my family, and I think they're just used to me pushing the envelope in different ways.
True youngest child energy.
Exactly.
You went to university undergrad in Canada, medical school in Ireland, and
Yes.
now we're in the States.
Yes.
What have you noticed is the same, but also more importantly, different in each of those areas when it comes to reproductive health care?
That's such a great question. And I think being in all those different places has given me such a unique perspective. So growing up in Canada, obviously socialized healthcare system, I think, you know, a lot of people look at that with rose-colored glasses, but I know the reality that there's good and bad to every system. And I found it so frustrating, you know, how long it takes to get in. And when I think about what I do now as a fertility doctor, I'm like, that would be very frustrating to me. And I think that's one of the reasons why I chose to end up staying here after I finished my training, because I do like the flexibility to be a little bit more immediate and intentional. And I feel like we don't have to follow the same rules of like, you need a referral and you need to wait this long. And if you need coverage, like you have to jump through these hoops. But it's nice that that system exists where coverage, you know, you can get coverage from the government. You know, in Ireland and in Europe in general, it's kind of similar in that way. I think for medical education, there's much more emphasis on using your hands and actually physically examining patients. And I think I became a very strong clinician because unlike the States where there's a tendency, a knee-jerk reaction to, first of all, always think in a defensive manner because of the litigious nature, the medical legal climate here. I think there's a lot more imaging that gets done and just kind of like cover yourself. Whereas I felt like in Ireland, that was less of a concern, and you really just thought about like what was the right thing to do, and you're also considering what makes sense in terms of allocation of resources. So from a public health standpoint, you think about things differently. But as someone who is a type A individual and helping people with really time-sensitive issues, I'm glad to be here. It's definitely far from perfect, and we have a lot of work to do in terms of making sure everyone has access to care. But something that's really encouraging and uplifting to me is that even in the short time that I've been in the field over the past decade, I've seen a huge shift in things like coverage for egg freezing. You know, 10 years ago, and we just published on this at my practice at RMA of New York where I work, 0% of egg freezing cycles were covered, and now it's almost 50%. And as a result of that access improving, mainly from the private sector, a lot more people are getting these benefits through their jobs. We're seeing the average age of the person going through egg freezing has dramatically shifted to a younger age. We're getting more eggs, they're healthier, and they have a better prognosis and chance for success. So I think there's positives and there are things to feel hopeful about here. But obviously, you know, just turn on the news and women's health is in the headlines in a lot of negative ways. So we have a lot of work to be done when it comes to inequities and making sure everyone has access.
Something I really admire about you is you are a stigma shatterer in a couple of different ways. You are one when it comes to talking openly about fertility. It's something with a lot of stigma and shame in our culture especially, and giving it a humane, informed, evidence-backed voice, which is so important in such an era of misinformation. You are also a stigma shatterer of what it's appropriate to be as a professional, having brought your expertise and like your humor into social media by delivering this information in such a manner that is accessible and attainable. So even if someone doesn't live in New York and can come see you to be to come be your patient, they still have access to that. And I want to kind of dive into this because we come from a culture that is, but what will they say?
Oh yeah.
Being kind of the filter with which many of us were raised and can form some of the decisions we made. You have in many ways rejected that or pushed through that. What is it like shattering stigma with humor and grace and really like concrete data to back up everything you're saying?
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I don't know that I set out with that goal, but I think it was just like a natural organic tendency. And what's funny is while I say I was pushing the envelope, I was always a very good girl growing up. Like, I'm a smart person and I'm strategic. So of course, I just did what I wanted to do and just didn't get caught, you know? And I was my own person and developed my own personality, but I also masked a lot of that to suit certain narratives. And so what's interesting is that now, you know, I'm in my 40s and I'm married, I have kids, I'm like established, but I feel like I've only come out to my community. Like now my mom's always like, oh, so-and-so auntie is following you and she sees all your videos. And like there's a connotation in there of like, what are you doing? And my mom and I have gotten into it because like this might be the one vehicle where she's actually seeing the real me. You know what I mean? Like my mom and I are close, but I think that a lot of us have done this growing up. It's like, you know, especially if you grew up in a strict household, it's like you have to play the game. And yes, your family knows you, but they maybe know one slice of you, but there's this other dynamic side that maybe you just don't reveal as much. But now I feel like I've put it all out there. And so it's been very freeing, but it definitely leads to some annoying conversations. Like even with my older sister, who's like 10 years older than me, she's much more conservative. And she's like, oh, it's kind of like, you know, crazy the things that you do. But at the end of the day, I think everyone appreciates it. I think the thing that I recognized early in my career is patients are so nervous when they're coming in to speak with me. They're so worked up because this is something they haven't shared with some of the closest people in their lives. And I think we're seeing this lift, thank God. But as you said, there's stigma and a lot of shame and a lot of like, I'm embarrassed when they shouldn't be. This is not their fault or anything that they did wrong or didn't do right. And I stopped wearing my white lab coat. Like I keep it draped on the back of my chair because I was like, well, we know that white coat syndrome is a real thing. People have high blood pressure because they're in the doctor's office and they feel nervous. That's an easy thing for me to just take away. You know, I just wear my regular outfit. They see my diplomas, they see my coat hanging on my chair, but I try to do things to disarm people. And I have found the biggest gift about me being on social media and not taking myself seriously is patients no longer look as nervous. A lot of them find me on Instagram or they book a patient visit with me and then they happen to like look me up and stumble across my profile. They walk in more familiar and feeling it's less daunting.
What do you wish, if you could go back and rewrite health curriculum for, you know, the middle, high school, but also a mandatory health curriculum in university and in your 20s, what would you want people to know about fertility preservation and their reproductive health?
Well, I love that you say that because that is something I'm telling everyone when I'm talking about my book. The whole reason I wrote it is because we don't have formalized health class education. We don't have a health class 2.0. It's like limited to high school where you have limited ability to understand the complexity of the reproductive system. And the goals are very different, let's be honest. And then I just think it's ridiculous that in our 20s, our 30s, often even our early 40s, we are expected to independently have a light bulb go off and be like, oh, I have to think about how to navigate my life goals, my personal and professional goals, my biological clock. And now I've decided I want to go from contracepting and avoiding pregnancy to now intentionally trying to get pregnant. Let me figure it all out whilst juggling a job and all my other aspirations. Let me figure out how to track my ovulation. And you're going online, you're stumbling upon good information, a lot of bad information. You're hoping that you have the right OBGYN that's going to spend the time to really educate you and fill in the knowledge gaps. A lot is left up to chance. And so I wish we did have some sort of formal, even if it was like a webinar that everyone could sign on to that was like validated and vetted by someone like me where they could learn about their biological clock, have a clear understanding, and have it be balanced, right? It's not like you fall off a cliff when it comes to your egg quantity and quality at age 35, but a lot of people think that. But also, conversely, people see the headlines and they're like, well, you know, if Janet Jackson could have kids in their 50s, like they're doing amazing things right now with IVF and all the science. And people come to me, you know, at ages where they have really unrealistic expectations. They're like, I've been on the pill for this long and I'm wondering if I should get off of it, and you know, I'm considering my options. And I'm like, the fact that you are at the top of your game in your career, you are so educated, but you have zero idea of what it means to be the age you are and what you should be thinking about and looking into, I think it's devastating. It's not fair. And it's really unfair that we're hoping that people just kind of stumble upon the right information. And I think everyone should have access and the ability to learn the things that they need to know. I think when it comes to their biological clock, it's understanding that no matter the lifestyle you lead, no matter all the things that you're trying to control, there are certain things that are certain when it comes to our biology, and our ability to ovulate a healthy egg starts changing more rapidly in our late 30s. But it doesn't mean you need my help to get pregnant. It's just about making a plan and having realistic expectations and understanding that science is there to help you strategize around things like this. But it can only take you so far, and it's all about having access to that information and exploring those options at an early enough age.
Okay. So say you're talking to a 20-something woman who doesn't know if she wants to have kids in the future.
Yeah.
She's on the fence, but you know, we talk about egg freezing as being an insurance policy. Mm-hmm. What would you recommend she review or read, and what options would you offer her?
Yeah, so I actually never say it's semantics, but I never call it an insurance policy because that implies that it kicks in. Exactly.
Yeah.
I always say it's like a head start if and should you ever need IVF, which by the way, it's not always going to be because of a female issue. Could be a partner with a very low sperm count, right? It could be that you and your partner both carry a genetic mutation, and because you want to be proactive and avoid passing that on, you decide to use a technology like IVF. And it could also be because of the biological clock, right? As I said, it gets harder to ovulate a healthy egg as we approach our 40s. And therefore, IVF can take human reproduction, a very inefficient process, and try to capitalize on the fact that instead of just relying on ovulating one egg, we have access to a whole bunch of eggs that come to the surface each cycle that get wasted. It's a very wasteful system when you think about it. It's maddening. But luckily, I have the know-how and expertise. Fertility doctors know how to have you take shots of the same hormone signal your brain normally sends to your ovaries to select one egg to randomly ovulate, and we can give that to you at a higher level. Those are the shots that people are taking when they're freezing eggs or going through IVF and having an egg retrieval. And the goal is to get all of them, whatever's available at the surface, to grow and mature. And it's almost like a banana that's ripe is easier to peel. Those follicles, those bubbles of fluid that contain eggs, when they get bigger and they ripen, it's easier to extract a mature egg. And so you're basically hijacking the system that we have to work with and saying, hey, this wasteful system, let's try to salvage those eggs before your body throws them away. And by the way, this is not harmful to your fertility because every month there's a new set of recruits that come up to bat. So doing this at an earlier age, if you can, is always more beneficial because for the same amount of effort, same amount of insurance benefits and costs, everything you put into it, you're going to have access to more eggs than you would at a later age, hypothetically. But more importantly, those eggs have a higher conversion rate to be able to become healthy embryos. So it's really giving yourself a head start saying, if I run into problems, instead of starting from scratch and trying to stimulate my ovaries when there's less to work with and they have a lower conversion rate, they're lower yield, let me go in to my supply that I froze when I was younger and give myself a massive head start, a better chance of success with IVF. And I would say the first step is really just learning about the process. And I think the best place to learn is to talk to an expert. I wrote this book because I think a lot of people maybe are reluctant to make that their first step. And I think someone today said in my office, a patient said to me, I know nothing about this and I refuse to do online searches because the minute I started trying to look up this, that, and the other, I was getting targeted ads. You know, all of this is very insidious and sneaky, but she was getting targeted ads about egg freezing and all these things, and she just felt like this was too much. So I do think we maybe have to kick it old school and like go back to reading books and talking to people face to face about these things, because I think you are a vulnerable population by virtue of being a woman, by virtue of being someone that's interested in fertility, trying to conceive, even when pregnant. I mean, we are a vulnerable population, and a lot of our fears and anxieties have been manipulated for financial gain. We have to be honest about that. And there's a lot of predatory marketing. So I think people are just so sick of that, and it's a lot of noise. So they're like, I just want good information. And I think finding reputable resources and talking to experts. And my biggest thing is, I'm not a fertility doctor that says to everyone, you must freeze your eggs. But I think if you could find yourself in a situation where you might be building your family in your mid to late 30s or later, it's smart to just learn about the process so you can make an informed decision. It doesn't mean you have to do it. But I definitely think it's easy to get, and I'm guilty of this too, stuck on the hamster wheel of life, and the years go by, and unless you intentionally carve out time to say, and it could look like journaling, meditation, having conversations with people, but you have to have an intentional conversation with yourself about, what do I really want out of this life? Because only when you kind of put it out there do you start acting in ways that propel you towards that goal. And I think people don't think about it like that, because they're like, well, it also depends on me finding the right partner, and how do I control that? But I remember being in my late 20s and being a busy resident and saying to myself, and also it was well-meaning advice from senior residents and people in medicine, women in medicine, being like, you need to have a plan, you need to think about this. And so that was really helpful to me. And I remember, feeling so exhausted and wanting to just collapse on the couch every night, but kind of saying, no, but I want to have this other part of my life flourish too. And so I'm going to go out. I'm going to put on the dress and I'm going to go out. And actually, that's how I met my husband. So, it really makes a difference to state your goal and put it at the forefront of your consciousness. And I know you love talking about manifesting, but
I do.
It's nothing magical. It's just you have to think about it and prioritize it.
Intention and effort.
Exactly.
We don't talk nearly enough as a society about male infertility. So if there are 20-something-year-old men watching this, what would you want to tell them to be aware of and how to gather the information for their future goals and family planning?
Yeah, well, I think the first fallacy that men are told is that they are invincible when it comes to their fertility, right? And they don't often understand the dangers of certain behaviors, even certain types of supplements. Taking testosterone, it's so paradoxical to a lot of men, actually acts like birth control. And it can permanently reduce sperm production. So I've had situations where, the male partner will have zero sperm or very low sperm count, and it comes to light that they were on testosterone. And, that's not something that a lot of people are properly counseled about. Smoking, excessive drinking, all of these lifestyle factors can affect, obviously, general health and their fertility. And I think that there is this idea of them being invincible because men are always making new sperm, right? So it feels like there's always opportunity to make healthier sperm later down the line. And we know that men can father children at older ages. But just because it can be done doesn't mean that it's just as healthy. And I think a big thing that needs to be, spoken about and men need to be educated about is that they do have a biological clock. It just ticks differently than ours. For us, we don't make new eggs over time and we don't fix our eggs. And so it becomes a bit more challenging to ovulate a healthy egg month after month as we get older. And treatments like IVF become more challenging as we have less eggs to work with, right? For men, they're always making new sperm, but they accumulate mutations in their DNA as they age that can then be passed on. And that can lead to what we see where there are higher rates of autism, certain developmental issues, childhood cancers. And it's not to say it's a huge shift in the absolute risk, but it's a real meaningful relationship. And I think that it's important. I have these conversations with people all the time because actually, you don't really see a lot of men saying, hey, I'm someone that's going to, because of my career or whatever, maybe I just haven't found the right person. I might be over 45. I might be even in my 50s when I'm having kids. It's actually so cheap and easy to freeze sperm. When you think about comparing that to the egg freezing process, they're not taking shots. They're doing something that they often do recreationally. They're just aiming for a cup and paying for the freezing of it and storage, So I mean, I think that it's something that we should talk about more. And certainly, you know, when couples come to me with infertility, it's like, I'm not just focusing on, oh, what is the woman's age? You know, what is her egg count? I'm also asking about his lifestyle, what medications he's taking, how can we improve things? Because that's actually, you know, one of those areas where you're like, this is an actionable thing that we can actually change, you know, the outcome of not just treatment. It's not just about getting someone pregnant, but there's studies that have actually related male health history, chronic medical conditions, especially uncontrolled, even things like obesity or sedentary lifestyle, those can be related to not just the health of their future children, but also the health of the pregnancy for their partner. Because the male contribution, people don't know this, the placenta is an organ that forms, it's quite magical. It's what shunts nutrients and oxygen to the growing baby, and it's the connection between mom and baby. And a lot of the genes that make up the development of a healthy placenta come from the paternal side.
I had no idea.
Yes. So it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about how society has fed people this lie that it's a woman's problem, even pregnancy complications. Now we can relate it back to both partners.
I cannot wait to go home and tell my sons this.
Yes, start the education early.
I mean, and we had that conversation about the HPV vaccine.
Yeah.
I had to have a hysterectomy because of cervical lesions and dysplasia from HPV-16. And actually, my oncologist, my surgeon, asked me if I wanted to freeze my eggs or do IVF in case I wanted to have a child. He goes, you can call Lucky.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know if I could get in with Lucky anymore. She's very popular, but that was an important conversation that, you know, Sri and I had to stop and say, do we think we might have a third? And that's when we both were like, definitively no, but to have the option to even be able to do that feels like such a gift compared to 30 years ago, 40 years ago when this practice of medicine barely existed.
Oh my gosh, one of the most gratifying parts of my work is, and it's hard, right? I meet people in these really difficult moments sometimes where they are diagnosed with breast cancer or any sort of medical problem that requires really rapid treatment. Like their oncologist says, you have 2 weeks and then you need to start chemotherapy. And maybe people listening aren't aware, but chemotherapy affects rapidly dividing cells and it can definitely have a detrimental impact on sperm and eggs. And so we carve out time to say, okay, you know, I'm meeting with you today, let's start your shots tonight. Like we don't have any time to waste, and let's do this process and get as many eggs as we can and freeze them. And we've seen so many people come back and they have so much hope because thankfully cancer survivorship has increased, you know, year over year. And we're not just worried about survival now, we're worried about quality of life and being able to preserve one's ability to have a family if they choose to later down the line. And maybe that looks like relying on surrogacy. Maybe it looks like being in remission for enough time that you can actually carry yourself. But the fact that those options exist, I agree, is a fantastic gift.
You've built an incredibly trusted brand online. And I can only imagine for a lot of people who want to be your patient, they can't be your patient all the time. What are some things you would like to tell people who want Dr. Lucky to be their doctor and can't have you as their doctor to get the best, to build a good relationship with a reproductive endocrinologist, how to find the right one to be able to, you know, set themselves up?
Yeah, I mean, I am in clinical practice and I am taking new patients. So
Okay,
I'm always very busy, but I have a high volume practice and I think that's what has led to being a good doctor because, you know, when you see everything, you feel so comfortable with every type of problem that can get thrown your way. It's just like, you want to go to someone that has seen and done a lot. That's the first thing. I think the way you feel about your doctor is obviously very important and you have to feel that doctor-patient relationship. There has to be trust. But I do think also people aren't asking enough questions about the clinics they're going to and the doctors they're seeing. Experience is everything, right? And then I think secondary to that is how you feel in that consult. And if your first impression, the first time you meet your doctor is that you're rushed and your questions aren't being addressed or you're feeling anxious to the point where you can't even remember what your questions were, and after the fact, there's no way to follow up and ask the questions that you have. Those are all big red flags, and I think that we need to have higher standards for ourselves. And it's hard because not everyone lives in places like New York City where, you can't walk a block without hitting a fertility clinic. But I think we have telehealth now. Like, there's a lot of other ways that you can get expert opinions, and I think don't settle. I think if you feel like there's a little voice in your head that says, we're not gelling well and I'm not really getting the answers and I'm not getting what I need from this, then don't settle. I think there's nothing wrong with getting a second opinion, a third opinion. There are many of my patients that came to me via second opinion, and I've seen, I'm not saying that there's one doctor that's going to be the miracle worker, but I think education has to be the foundation. And one thing that I do pride myself on that a lot of my patients will say to me is, this has never been explained to me in this way. And I think that that's really important to find in a doctor. You have to know. I mean, when I think about, I went through IVF myself, so I have a unique perspective as a patient. And I always think to myself, it was so much easier for me because I knew exactly why I was doing what I was doing and what the meds were. And I just can't fathom that anyone would do something to this with this gravity of, okay, you're maybe paying a lot of money and it's like you're going through this very physical process and it's emotionally charged. To do that blindly without understanding the why and what's happening, I don't think that's acceptable. And so that's actually why I wrote this book. That's why I do what I do on social media. It's really to decode things that feel like learning a new language when you're in a time of your life where you're already overwhelmed. And that's why I think understanding things ahead of time, like that Health Class 2.0 concept, is so important because it's just essential. It's essential, and it's very time-sensitive information. And I think you're going to get more out of your planning, more out of your consult if you do go see a fertility doctor, if you go into it a little bit educated.
Yeah. I love that you said never settle, because I think that is really strong life advice as a whole for people who want to build beautiful, big, bold lives. I think it's something that, is this something you would tell your younger self, or if you ever got to meet your younger self, what would you tell her?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of my weaknesses, I'll say, is I'm a chronic people pleaser. And as I turned 40, and I know this is so cliche, but it was this natural thing where I was like, oh, I can say no, And it's like all my friends who also turned 40, it's like we all collectively came to this realization at the same time. Part of it's how I was raised, and also I think that people pleasers, there's gain to it, right? Like generally you're easy to get along with. People are nicer to you because you're you're playing the game. You can get by life easier, but I think it's very harmful in some ways. And so when I say don't settle, get a second opinion, I see some of these traits extend to the way certain patients are. And there are some patients that are very quick to be people pleasers, and they're like, I just want to be agreeable. But if you're not being treated the way you should be, or you're not getting what you need to, or you need to advocate for yourself, that doesn't mean you're a bad person or you're unlikable. I think that we all have to learn to be better self-advocates. And my biggest thing in life, and I think medicine just made it a whole lot worse, because it's very much like the army. You're like, I just got to fall into line. A lot of doctors are chronic people pleasers. And then you wake up one day and you realize it's to your own detriment. And you often end up putting the people in your life that are really important to you on the back burner because you're too busy running around people pleasing for others, So I know you talk about this a lot, on your platform, and I've learned a lot from even hearing you talk about it, because I think having boundaries is really important in all areas of life.
What do you think your younger self would tell you? 40-something-year-old, you're lucky.
It's going to be great. Like, I could never have imagined, I didn't have a grand plan for any of the things that have happened, including writing this book. I actually said to my husband, like when I was on the precipice of getting a book deal, I cried in my kitchen because I was like, I just know how difficult this is going to be. It's going to be a huge sacrifice. But I also just feel like this opportunity has come to me and I am the one to do it. And I just have to get through it. And I honestly blacked out the last year of writing this thing, because it was just pouring everything I've got into it while seeing patients. And I shut out every other part of my life. I really was like kind of antisocial and sedentary. I'm still trying to get back on track. But now that I'm on the other end of it, I'm like, I'm so excited that I did this, but I have no idea how it all came together. It all happened very organically. Like, the story behind this book is so insane. My book agent is someone who was going through infertility and using my Instagram to educate herself because she didn't feel like she was getting answers. And then she found a mutual friend that we were linked on Instagram, and she asked her about me, and she goes, oh yeah, I think she said in passing she wants to write a book. So that's how that meeting happened. We had a crazy brainstorm session, and her transfer failed at the other clinic. And then once we decided to work together, like a week later, she's like, can I become your patient too? Is that weird? So I'm doing her monitoring scans and checking her follicles. She's asking me, how's the proposal coming along? And I'm like, this is a lot. And it's so crazy. It sounds cheesy. It's like something out of a Hallmark movie, but she got pregnant around the time that I got the book deal. She had her baby the same weekend I handed in my manuscript. And what's crazy is the person who at Macmillan that took me on and is my editor, she came to our first meeting with a notebook filled with notes from I used to do Ask Dr. Lucky lives on Instagram weekly, and I really want to get back to doing it once the book craziness is over. And she was like, you helped me through my IVF journey. So my team, my book team, is organically like IVF warriors, women that are so just committed to the mission of putting out in the universe the information they wish they had during their journey. Isn't that nuts? Isn't that such a crazy story? And that's the example of what I would say to myself when I was younger. Like, everything is going to shift and the universe is going to conspire in your favor. Once you figure out what your life mission is, everything will align.
Thank you so much for joining us today on That Desi Spark, Lucky.
Thank you for having me. I love this show and I love everything that you do. And I feel like we barely scratched the surface. There's so much that I want to say to the South Asian community specifically, because I have a lot of Indian patients, and growing up in this culture and now treating so many patients, as a fertility doctor, I will say there are commonalities and themes when it comes to stigma, maybe waiting a little longer than they should to come see doctors. And I just want you to know that I feel very privileged to provide representation. And that's something that's really important. And I think that the problems that we face, the challenges we face, are very unique to us. And conversations like this give me a lot of hope that we can keep kind of pushing the needle forward and lifting that stigma and making people feel less alone and more inclined to get the help they need when they need it.
You're lucky, Didi.
Exactly. Just don't call me auntie.
No auntie.
I'm not there yet.
Nope. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.